Good afternoon, and thanks for joining us. We will be starting the webinar in about 5 minutes.
Hello?
Good afternoon, and thanks for joining us. We will be starting the webinar in about 3 minutes.
Thank you, sir.
Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. We will be starting the webinar in about 2 minutes. Thank you for joining us, folks. We will start in 1 minute. Good afternoon, and welcome to today's webinar featuring Power in Purpose, Cooperative Policy Roundtable Series. This webinar is produced by the National Cooperative Business Association in partnership with the Cooperative Development Foundation and in association with the Federation of Southern Cooperatives Land Assistance Fund. This webinar marks the 10th meeting of the Cooperative Policy Roundtable. Before we begin, just a bit of housekeeping. Participant phone lines will be muted during this presentation to reduce background noise. There will be a chance to pose questions, just not verbally. If you have a question, please type it into the question box on the GoToWebinar control panel on your screen. Questions will be collected and answered at the end of the program. NCBA CLUSA will be recording this program and it will be available on our website. You will receive an email containing a link to the posted recording by the end of the week. Now, with that said, I'll turn the webinar over to our moderator, the Executive Director of the Federation of Southern Cooperatives, Cornelius Blanding. Cornelius. Cornelius, we just need you to unmute your microphone. I am sorry, Cornelius, we seem to be having trouble with your microphone.
What about now?
There we go. All right, thank you so much.
So I'll start over and sorry about that. Again, welcome everybody, and John, thank you. Thank you to NCBA and CDF for being co-host of this webinar as well. This webinar is it's a Co-op Policy Roundtable webinar, which is a part of the Power and Purpose series. So really welcome to this webinar, and I'm Cornelius Blanding, the Executive Director of the Federation of Southern Cooperatives Land Assistance Fund. The Federation is a cooperative association of Black farmers, landowners, and cooperatives all around the South. Our mission is to be a catalyst for the development of self-supporting communities through cooperatives, cooperative development, land retention, and advocacy. Our focus areas are just that: co-op economic development, land retention, and advocacy. And advocacy, which is the main reason that we're here today. We originally planned this as a cooperative roundtable in Mississippi, but because of the coronavirus and all its impact, we had to do this webinar. So again, pleased to be here and pleased to have you all join us. The purpose of this webinar is to give you an idea of the landscape of issues affecting African American cooperatives all around the South. We will also discuss some of those issues as well as some potential solutions, especially as it relates to advocacy. We will also highlight the scale of the involvement of the co-op community overall in this work and around legislative issues, especially enabling co-op legislation. And we'll tie in some other important pieces, such as land retention, and specifically heirs property legislation and how it impacts co-ops. We will also incorporate some case studies here and give you some examples from our work over the years. And we will hear about some of the issues directly from co-ops and from folks who are working with co-ops out in our communities. But ultimately, our goal here is simple: is to influence enabling co-op legislation. And so with that, I want to introduce one of our partners, Doug O'Brien, the President and CEO of NCBA CLUSA, who is not only a colleague, but a good friend. And Doug will talk more about why we are here, NCBA and the co-op community's involvement in this, and the Power and Purpose series, specifically the series that this webinar is a part of. So with that, I'll turn it over to Doug.
Doug, I'm sorry, I think you're muted as well. Nope, not yet. Hang in there with us, folks. We're going to attempt to call in one more time. There we go. Cornelius, while Doug is calling in, could you tell us a little bit more about the Federation of Southern Cooperatives?
I will. I'm unmuted, right? So I will. Let me, and while we're waiting for Doug O'Brien to join us, let me kind of go back and again, as I mentioned to you, the Federation of Southern Cooperatives is a cooperative association of Black farmers, landowners, and co-ops all around the South. Our work is actually in 13 Southern states, but focused and concentrated in 4 of them. That's where we have the majority of our staff, also a large part of our membership in our cooperative associations. And over the years, one of the biggest challenges we've had as an organization is around co-op legislation. The Federation itself is chartered in DC because it couldn't get chartered in the South where we operate. So we're operating as a foreign entity, even in our home in the South. And that's been a challenge not only for us as an organization or as a cooperative association, but also for those co-ops who make up the Federation. And this is extremely important because many of our co-ops have been forced to organize as nonprofits or other types of businesses, which limit the overall purpose in terms of making sure that resources go back into these communities and there's democratic ownership of not only organizations, but of the infrastructure that is acquired over the years. And so this is something that's been important to us for years and something we worked on. And you'll hear from people like Melba Smith in this, who will talk about some of the work we've done in Mississippi around enabling co-op legislation. Doug, I think you rejoined us. Still can't hear you, Doug. So as Doug trying to circle around to get his microphone taken care of, I just continue to talk about really the value of this, not only this webinar, but this roundtable, this co-op roundtable, this work, and many of the partners, many of you who have joined us. And again, we thank you for joining for this important series. But what we hope to do is hear a lot from those co-ops and those folks who work with co-ops, including the presenters who are here today, to take what we've heard today, take what we've talked about and what we worked on over the years to bring as a part of this overall Power of Series purpose and to give to NCBA and the cooperative community as part of this work so that we can build a cooperative advocacy platform that's inclusive of all. And so with that, I'll turn this over to you, Doug.
Okay, you can hear me now. I apologize for the technical difficulties, and I'll move through my comments to try and make up time because really, as Cornelius just suggested, the purpose of this webinar is to make sure that we're able to hear about the circumstance, the ideas, the challenges, and the solutions in facing and you know, that are in the context of Black farmers in the South. So I'll just go through a few things here. I am Doug O'Brien. I'm the president and CEO of the National Cooperative Business Association, Cooperative League of the United States of America. Next slide. And just to set the tone, I think Cornelius pretty much has already set this out. What we're up to, and this is the 10th of a series and essentially the last of the series, that we have been around the country asking the question and identifying public policy initiatives that encourage and support the development of cooperatives as a tool to strengthen the health, equity, and sustainability of local economies and communities. So important for us to be able to hear from the communities in the South. And so we're so excited to have this webinar today. Next slide. Just a little bit about NCBA CLUSA. NCBA was founded 103 years ago. Our mission always has been to advocate, promote, and defend the cooperative business model. Just a few years ago, the board of NCBA CLUSA, which includes leaders from across the cooperative community here in the United States, and in fact, including Cornelius Blanding, who has served on the board for a number of years, and the Federation for Southern Cooperatives has essentially always been represented on the NCBA CLUSA board. So this association in our work in promoting and advocating for cooperative business model, just a few years ago, the board determined that the best way for cooperatives to make an impact and influence today is to make sure that policymakers and other thought leaders understand how cooperatives can build a more inclusive economy. And as we embrace this new vision for NCBA CLUSA and for the cooperative community, we partnered with the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, who provided resources for us to engage in a number of activities that really digs deeper into how cooperatives can help build a more inclusive economy. A little over a year ago, we released a paper called The ABCs of Cooperative Impact that is a framework to measure how co-ops impact the economy and society. We've also released a number of sectoral case studies in different sectors of the cooperative economy, kind of going deeper in providing examples of how those co-ops in that sector really provide and make that impact. And the final kind of big piece that we're working on is this policy paper. And soon, in the next quarter or so, we will release a paper that essentially outlines policies that empower people to use co-ops to build local economies. And what we're doing today is we're hearing from the Federation from Southern Cooperatives and others in your community on ideas of those types of policies. Next slide. So, just a few, these are the types of questions that we've been asking. What policies are needed to assure that cooperatives survive and thrive? What are the current barriers to these policy changes? And of the policy changes discussed, which are the most important? Next slide. As we work through this process, we've asked people to think about the policy levers that exist. What are those tools in a toolbox that one can use to really use policy to make change? And here's a listing. I won't talk about every one of them. Cooperatives, obviously, financing, technical assistance, so important. Other advocacy related policies, procurement policies these are the kind of levers that we're just kind of getting people's wheels spinning on things that can help cooperatives really make an impact. Next slide. Generally, in the conversations that we've had across the country, the findings have sort of fallen into or categorized into 4 buckets. The first is cooperative education and awareness. We certainly see a challenge that in certain parts of the country, in state houses or different municipalities, the policymakers either don't know about co-ops or they don't really understand the cooperative identity and what it can do for their communities. The second is technical assistance and training. We have a fantastic set of cooperative development specialists, including those at the Federation for Southern Cooperatives, but there's not enough. Relative to other types of business forms, there are not enough professionals and the resources to make sure that those professionals can do their job to help people develop and establish cooperatives. Access to capital has always been a challenge for cooperatives, and I think as much today as in any other time. And finally, we certainly have heard a lot about the barriers. And we've heard some consistent themes about the barriers for people to establish cooperatives. And so those are some of the findings that we've seen in the past. And then finally, next slide, we've asked people to kind of put forward and think about what are some of those strategies and tactics. Now that we've identified those types of questions that we should ask, the policy levers that are there, prioritize some of those policies, we got to think about how do we get this done? What are some of those tactics for the cooperative community to come together and really make change? So those are the types of questions that we're asking there. So that, the final thing I'd like to mention is the moment that we're in, this COVID-19 moment, which is both a public health and an economic crisis. And sadly, as with any type of crisis like this, those who are already marginalized in society tend to be the ones who suffer the most. And I suspect that is the case again with COVID-19. I mention that because it only points up how critical that this work is in defining and identifying ways that people can use cooperatives to build a more inclusive economy. Now is a moment when people are truly in need of strategies to create more economic opportunity and stability for their families and their communities. And we know that cooperatives are one of those tactics. So with that, I want to thank the Federation for Southern Cooperatives again. I also want to thank the Cooperative Development Foundation, Leslie Mead, who is the executive director of CDF and who's really been the lead in organizing and moving forward this project. So I'll hand it off now to Terrence and look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Hello?
We can hear you, Terrence.
Excellent, excellent. Well, thanks, Cornelius. Thanks, Doug. I think you two have really kind of given us the right backdrop and context for this conversation. So I'll say good afternoon to everyone on the webinar. I'm glad you're all here today. I hope all of you have managed to stay healthy and safe during this lockdown. And I'm grateful to be here with you today to talk about a topic that I believe that is more in need now than when we first discussed putting these roundtables and webinar together. Just as Doug just mentioned, in the past few weeks, we've seen the coronavirus global pandemic not only stall out the US economy, but global economy as well, thrusting millions of people into and underemployment, sending shockwaves throughout communities all over the nation. And as Doug also mentioned, historic inequities are being exacerbated. You know, we're seeing a strong disproportionate impact of deaths and illness from the virus on Black communities and in communities in the South and in rural communities that lack strong healthcare infrastructure. So these historic disparities that we are all familiar with are being highlighted in a new and more virulent way. So now is the perfect time to begin a discussion about what we can do to improve and advance cooperative development through policy reform. I think we can all agree that cooperative development can be a key component not only to the short-term recovery from the impact of the coronavirus, but also the long-term recovery from the impact of nearly centuries of persistent inequity, poverty, and deprivation. And when we talk about legislation and policy reform, I think we need to pay particular attention to the South. It's the part of the country with the weakest laws in favor of cooperatives. Next slide. It's the region with the highest poverty rates. Next slide. It's the region with the lowest wages. Next slide. And it's the region with the most income inequality. So all these metrics and more demonstrate that the South is a place where there is a great need for a new economic paradigm. And we all understand that cooperative development begins with identifying the need. So, you know, one of the greatest things about my role as the Director of Cooperative Development and Strategic Initiatives for the Federation is that it affords me with the opportunity to travel across the South and engage our members, staff, and individuals who are struggling day to day to create and strengthen their co-ops in the midst of what amounts to key structural impediments. And what I found is that a lack of co-op friendly legislation across the South acts to hinder our progress at every level. Next slide. You know, we are limited by the kinds or diversity of co-ops we can develop. Here in the South, most states really only recognize two kinds, either ag or agricultural co-op or rural electrics. So that really kind of limits us to two key sectors, one of which the rural electrics is hard for us to enter anyway. Second, it places us at an economic disadvantage compared to corporations where we cannot access key tax benefits, kinds of loans, and investment opportunities. So a key avenue for resources is denied to us. And finally, we lack, really the instruments to protect the internal democracy of our enterprises. In states where we have strong cooperative development statutes, democracy is embedded in the laws, thus, preserving democracy for the long term, perpetuity-wise. Whereas here, as Cornelia said, often when we have to develop them as nonprofits or LLCs, the struggle to maintain that internal democracy over years can be very strong. So in essence, I'm saying in the South, there's very little in the way of laws and policies to support the long-term viability, let alone the democracy of our cooperatives. And I think this is not simply a problem for us living in the South. Having a whole region in the United States in what amounts to economic crisis creates conditions for hyper-exploitation, which in effect over the last 40 to 50 years has driven capital resources from northern regions where they're escaping stronger worker protections and stronger cooperative competition to the South and the global South to find lower wages and weaker benefits. So it's in the interest of northern cooperatives, I believe, to see more co-op policy reform in the South. And I think cooperative reform is going to look like this. Next slide. It's going to enable us to build more viable and enduring cooperatives. It's going to help us preserve the internal democratic principles of our cooperatives, and probably more importantly, from a strategic point of view, and in terms of creating new economic paradigms that are more fair and just, it's going to help us create stronger regional infrastructure of cooperative institutions. So that's an outcome I think we all want to reach, and it's going to benefit the South not only by creating solid economic alternatives for Black, brown, and even white working class communities, but also in the North by creating more sustainable opportunities for partnerships with Southern cooperatives and eliminating an option for capital that might want to flee the North to find desperate people to exploit in the US South and global South. But we know this work won't be easy. As a matter of fact, for the past 6 to 7 years in Mississippi, our MAC chapter, Mississippi Association of Cooperatives, has been working on enabling legislation, and that struggle continues. After me, you're going to hear from Melba Smith, who has kind of led the campaign in Mississippi to reach enabling legislation. Then after that, we're going to ask you to consider different facets of this work, such as the question of land. We're going to have our Director of Land Retention and Advocacy, Monica Range, talk to you about the strategic importance of land and heirs property and the long-term viability of cooperatives, especially in the South, and especially as it relates to rural communities, Black communities. And then we're going to have Ben Burkett from Mississippi talk to you about the impact of the coronavirus on our cooperatives and Black farmers. And I think, as Doug highlighted, it really signals a time that we need to think as comprehensively as possible about legislation and policy reform, because we know that the impact of the coronavirus is going to have long-term implications, and we need to deal with that. So up next, I'm going to ask Melba to kind of give us a policy snapshot of the Mississippi case study.
Terrence, I don't think I see Melba.
So Go ahead, Terrence. So it looks like we're having some technical difficulties with Melba. So Terrence, what we do is Terrence also mentioned Monica Range, who's our Director of Land Retention and Advocacy, talking about land and heirs property legislation specifically and how it impacts co-ops, how we, the Federation, view that work and how we tie it into co-op development and its impact on cooperative legislation. So until we get Melba, Monica, we'll ask Monica Range to come on and talk about land and heirs property specifically. Monica.
My name is Monica Range, and I serve as the Director of Land Retention and Advocacy for the Federation of Southern Cooperatives. It is my pleasure to be a part of this webinar today and to share some important discussion points about our land retention policy and how it is a key strategy for the economic sustainability of Black-owned cooperatives in the South. It is difficult to have a comprehensive discussion about economic sustainability of cooperatives in the South without discussing or examining the impact of Black land loss and the impact that it has had with the sustainability of cooperatives. Some of you may know that in 1910, African Americans owned at least 15 to 16 million acres across the South. By 1992, that number had dropped to 2.3 million. And according to our census data today, African Americans own about 3.9 million acres. In the rural South, it has historically relied upon its land base to build an agrarian economy. And that economy has been the backbone and the lifeblood of the Black community. For many African American farmers who still farm today on land that has been passed down through generations, they are often referred to as land rich and cash poor. When land is a productive asset, it has the potential to generate economic stability and opportunity. At the Federation, we've taken a holistic approach to supporting our cooperatives and expanding cooperatives by ensuring that we secure one of their most important assets, the land. So what is our challenge today? Our greatest challenge is that we have a $6.6 billion problem hiding in plain sight. It is estimated that 1.6 million acres of farmland across the Black Belt region is heirs property. 60% of all Black-owned land is in heirs property. So what is heirs property? Heirs property results when a landowner or farmer dies without a will or a succession plan. His or her farm or land is then passed down through the generations to other family members who may still be farming that land. This farmland becomes both a blessing and a curse to that family as heirs property. Because you see, the title is not clear, and the family members, who could be a group as small as 2 or 3, or a group as large as 200 or 300, share ownership of that property as tenants in common. Heirs property has many challenges. One, the land lacks clear title, which means that it presents a challenge for the heirs property owners to successfully leverage the equity or capital in that land. These landowners can't go to a bank to secure conventional financing, and in most cases, they're ineligible for USDA programs, even disaster relief programs. The insecurity in their land makes it also difficult for them to be productive members of a cooperative and to help that cooperative secure much needed resources to expand and grow across the South. Heirs property continues to be one of the greatest challenges that our farmers face in African American communities across the South. And the Federation has looked at and addressed this issue for over 53 years using many land retention policy strategies. Our goal is to try to level the playing field for African American farmers who, like most farmers, need land on their balance sheet as an asset to continue to access the equity that they need to grow and expand their farming operations. In the 2018 Farm Bill, the Federation led advocacy to address the heirs property issue by creating legislation that would entitle heirs property owners to become eligible for most of the USDA programs, even farm loan programs, that they were not eligible for because they had no proof of ownership or clear title in their farm. The Farm Bill of 2018 creates what's called a heirs property relending program, which will entitle cooperatives to assist their members in gaining those resources needed to resolve their heirs property issues, including getting a farm succession plan. Now that's the good news about the 2018 Farm Bill. The bad news is the legislation appropriating this relending piece was authorized at $10 million. However, the House and Senate passed budgets including only $5 million for the heirs property relending program. The president's budget, consequently, included only $3 million for this program. And now for the ugly. The relending program, 16 months into the Farm Bill cycle, has not been implemented. So farmers, cooperative members, and landowners across the South are still waiting for this relief that could potentially change their financial picture. So it's important at this time that we continue to build on policies like the heirs property relending piece that will continue to secure land tenure for farmers of color and ensure that once these farms transition to the next generation, that these farms will become viable and that we can continue to have economically viable and strong cooperative membership because they have the access to capital that is necessary to address these issues and expand. So I'm going to stop right there. I think that would be my time. And then I will hand over to Melba to continue a discussion and case study on Mississippi.
So thanks, Monica. And we're trying to work out the technical issues that Melba was having. We don't think she'll be able to join by video, but I'm hoping Melba has been unmuted and you can hear the audio version of her presentation. Melba, Melba, can you hear us? Melba. So I think we're still having some technical challenges with Melba's, even the audio aspect of her connection to this webinar. We'll try one more time to get her worked out. If she can't join in, then right now we'll move on to Ben Burkett. Ben will be talking about he's one of the case studies. We're talking about the work down in Mississippi, specific from his co-op's perspective, one of the co-ops of the Federation of Southern Cooperatives, but also the perspective of a small farmer as part of a co-op. And so we'll bring Ben in right now to give his perspective, and hopefully we'll have Melba to bring her in at the end to give that example of this case study or the work that's going on around legislation in Mississippi. Ben, are you there? Ben Burkett. So it looks like we're having a number of issues here with Ben and Melba. Look, let me just kind of summarize a little bit about Melba's presentation in reference to the work that was going on in Mississippi. I was around co-op legislation. We looked, again, Terrence brought up the fact and the issue co-ops, the challenge of having co-op legislation, enabling legislation in the South. And it's something that we've been working on for a number of years. And so the approach we decided to take in this was to look at one state as a case study and figure that we can move past that state could serve as an example or model for the other states in the South. And Mississippi has been always one of those tougher nuts for us to crack. And so we started out in Mississippi. Again, we had a strong office there, strong membership, strong staff. And so we looked at this enabling legislation in Mississippi as a starting point. And Melba, as Terrence mentioned, was key to a lot of that and continues to be key. What we found in Mississippi was that one of the biggest hurdles was around the way the states view co-op legislation. The South is a very anti-union region. And so what many of the legislators thought was this was just another attempt to bring unions in. And so we spent considerable amount of time making sure they understood the difference between co-ops and unions. And so not that we have anything against unions, but they're different. And so wanted to make sure that this was no hidden agenda or anything. It was just trying to figure out how to develop some legislation where co-ops could thrive and survive in Mississippi and in the South. So that was a huge challenge, but that was something that we started working through with individuals throughout the legislation and had a lot of the co-ops and other nonprofit and other type organizations in Mississippi to get engaged in a partnership with us to create this coalition, if you will, in Mississippi, where folks talked about their experience of co-ops and some of the co-ops brought their voices directly to the table. And we were able to get some traction with the Secretary of State and others in Mississippi to understand this difference. We were successful in getting the House during 1 year to pass some co-op enabling legislation, but it didn't pass the Senate. The next year we were able to get the Senate to pass, but it didn't pass the House. So go figure. But it was years of back and forth and trying to figure out how to work through this issue. We've made some progress, but we're not there yet. So we're thankful for this Power and Purpose series. We're thankful for the co-op community, NCBA, and others in particular to joining into this cause and making sure that our voice is also heard on the national platform. But looking at this from a much broader perspective, especially as it relates to uniform cooperative laws. So we're hopeful that the example that we provided, some of the work that's on the ground, and even the challenges that we had can feed into a bigger narrative with the national cooperative community, the co-op community nationally, and the National Cooperative Business Association in terms of really figuring out how to move this ball. Once this ball is moved to Mississippi, we're confident that we can replicate it in other states in the South and finally get some good co-op enabling legislation all around the South. So that's I can't give this presentation the kind of justice that Melba would have given it because Melba was on the ground working with this every day for a number of years. But I hope I provided a high level overview in terms of what that work looked like and some of the challenges of it. And hopefully it can feed into what we're thinking about and what we're doing and help create a stronger narrative on the national stage. So now let me see again if Ben is available to join this call. Ben was going to talk about this from the perspective of a farmer, from the perspective of a member of a co-op, a cooperative of the Federation, and his perspective in terms of a case study. Ben, are you there? Let me ask Terrence. Terrence, if you don't mind, will you join in? Because I know you've been doing some work with our co-ops individually and even with Ben, and maybe you can join me in this and we can talk a little bit about some of the things that are going on with co-ops specifically and with Ben in Mississippi generally.
Yes. So, you know, in previous conversations with Ben, I think it's clear that the coronavirus is having a very big impact, at least on our farmers from that region of Mississippi and Louisiana. We're getting reports of losses upwards of 30% in terms of their typical earnings, you know, outside of the impact. And much of that is the result of the massive lockdowns across the state, which have basically cut off a certain level of the markets that our farmers and cooperatives would typically use to keep themselves going. So they're trying to find alternatives, but it's a struggle when all of a sudden 30% of your income kind of disappears and, you know, your expenses remain the same, you can see how challenging that is, especially for many of our farmers who are small family farmers who are part of cooperatives. You know, year to year is always kind of a struggle to keep one's head above water. So something like this will have not only, as I said before, a short-term impact, but it's going to have long-term reverberations, even as it may relate to land retention. When we consider that most farmers today in the South are in their late 50s, early 60s. They don't, you know, and some may have health issues. If an heirs property issue were to occur now, I think people will be even more challenged now to resolve it and to hold on to land. So there are many implications. It's a web, and I think again, the more comprehensively we can think about cooperative policy reform, the better. Instead of just kind of piecemealing it here and there, I think we need to think of kind of a tapestry of reforms that we're going to drive for.
Now, thanks for that, Terrence. And also, I want to go back and thank you for painting that picture, that broader picture of the stark differences in the inequalities in the South, especially as it relates to co-ops and legislation. I want to back up and also thank Monica in terms of talking about heirs property specifically as one of those barriers. And as Doug mentioned in his presentation, that we're looking at some of the findings and making sure we incorporate what we're talking about here into those findings and looking at the barriers, and this heirs property being one of them. But understanding that when we look at our co-ops as a federation, we've always looked at them from the standpoint of we know that our co-ops are only as strong as its weakest member. And generally, some of those weaker members, figuratively speaking, are the ones who have these heirs property issues. They have insecure land tenure. And this causes a problem, and this has caused a problem over the years and has resulted in not only the loss of land, but the loss of members in these co-ops, the loss of assets with these co-ops, and the loss of the ability for these co-ops to effectively market their crops and have a bigger base. So it does reverberate all the way through the co-op community, all the way through the federation, what happens to one of these individual farmers and or landowners. So really want to point that out again and say, and in the case of Mississippi and in the case of Ben, he's talked specifically about some of the markets in New Orleans. New Orleans is a big market for the co-ops in Mississippi, for some of the farmers in Mississippi. And as you know, Louisiana and New Orleans is one of those areas in the South in the country that's been hit harder than others from this coronavirus. And so that has impacted the markets for these farmers and these co-ops significantly. And these farmers, these co-ops are still supplying some of this market. And Terrence mentioned as much as 30% has been lost, but they're still going to New Orleans as one example to the farmers market there to supply customers, but they have to supply them much differently. They have to supply them with much higher costs. They have to package this stuff differently now. And the revenue from it is not getting any higher. So it's causing significant problems. Co-ops, we have been reporting they're losing in the neighborhood of $1,000 a month just from operating expenses from their facilities. So this is something we're trying to address on an individual farmer, individual member perspective, but also from a cooperative perspective in terms of keeping these enterprises afloat, because many times these farmers, these co-ops are anchors in their communities. And Ben's co-op, Indian Springs, is one example. It's an anchor in Petal, Mississippi. The land also houses the church, the Masonic Lodge, and other things. So the loss of these co-ops mean much more for these communities, and they're being impacted on a very disproportionate basis because of this coronavirus and because of other inequalities in the South, as Terrence pointed out. So this work is extremely important, again, from an individual member and or farmer level, but also on a cooperative level. And so, Doug, thanks for joining back, and please join to this conversation with us, because as we're starting to close out, really would love to hear some closing comments from you and how this all impacts, and then field some questions as we go along.
Sure. Yeah, no, thank you. Fantastic, every one of the panelists. Some great input and some great observations. I'll just mention very briefly on staying on the COVID COVID-19 and the economic crisis to cooperatives. We at NCBA CLUSA have been working very hard to make sure that as many types of cooperatives as possible are eligible and have access to the disaster assistance that Congress has rolled out thus far, and I suspect there'll be more tools. We have a website, a COVID-19 website on ncbaclusa.coop. Take a look. There's some webinars, fact sheets, etc. In terms of the co-ops in the region, Black farmer co-ops, there's both some USDA programs as well as perhaps some SBA programs that may apply to some of the cooperatives in your region. So I really appreciate the work that the Federation's doing to try and protect the economy and those co-ops in the region. There are some questions, at least a couple questions here, Cornelius, and we have a little bit of time. I have access to the to a question here that I think it might be best for you, Cornelius. What are some of the ways that the 1890s, those land-grant colleges, can support the cooperative movement? And I'll just remind everybody as you're teeing up there, Cornelius, that there is a chat box. Please ask your questions through the chat box and we'll be able to get them to the panel in that way. Cornelius.
Yeah, but Doug, thanks a lot, and thanks for that question. And Doug, let me step back before I answer that question and say, thanks for shining the light on this and talking about the seriousness of this work, because I think if people didn't realize it before, this coronavirus situation, this lockdown has shown how important this work is overall. So thanks for talking about that and these findings that you found, and we're happy to make sure that our voices are heard and part of that overall conversation as we move forward. And thanks for the website. We too, the Federation, have provided a COVID-19 page on our website to complement what you all have put out there so we can work in tandem, because I think it's going to take all of us providing information, resources, and technical support to the co-op community in these days, which brings me to my answer around the 1890 community, the Black land grant universities. We, the Federation, have had relationships with the 1890s, these land grants, for a number of years. In each state, we try to figure out how do we connect to the land grant university system, particularly around some of their strengths. For instance, in Mississippi, Alcorn University, we do a joint farmers conference with them to make sure that we're talking about our issues in a collective manner, not just from a farmer, but also from a cooperative. In these cooperatives, they are individual farmers, and the 1890s have been great at providing extension services. So really making sure that we coordinate our activities. When we look at a farmer as an individual, make sure that we understand if that farmer is part of a collective, and providing extension work to that individual, but with a collective framework in mind, is one of the things that first come to mind in terms of how do we work better with the 1890 community, especially as it relates to extension work to individual farmers and members as part of these overall co-ops. And so really understanding that. We do that when we do our work with organizations through USDA, agencies within USDA, like NRCS as an example. Many of these programs provide irrigation and other type of things, but if one farmer has irrigation or has the timing from these resources and another farmer has something completely different, it impacts them as a co-op in terms of how they can supply a market. And so looking at the way 1890 supports their farmers as part of co-ops, I think is a big plus in how we can work. And then one example I want to point out also is the work we're doing with Tuskegee University in terms of working with Tuskegee to develop a co-op curriculum where we can start educating students about co-ops. We can make sure the students who are part of these 1890s and learning to become extension agents, ag teachers, or whatever they go, that they understand the co-op community and they start to contribute. And so we're in the early phases of developing those co-op curriculums. Been doing it for a number of years with partners like CHS, who provided some funding years ago for Tuskegee to work with us to help develop a curriculum where we can then bring students to intern positions to become managers of co-ops. So there are a number of ways, and those two ways particularly come to mind.
That's great. Those are great examples, and that last example of making sure that we build that pipeline of expertise for technical assistance, I think is so critical, not only in the South, across the country, but probably particularly in your region. Another question, maybe time for one more question, and I do want to say that any questions that are put in the chat box that we don't have a chance to address today, we'll capture those. We'll certainly, the Federation, NCBA, and CDF will work together to integrate those ideas or those questions, get those answered as soon as possible. So the next, one other question, next question here, Cornelius or anybody for the panel, is one of the lessons from these roundtables thus far is that cooperatives and their associations can effectively influence co-op policy when those co-ops work together across lines and class and region. So how can co-op associations outside the South most effectively support the efforts of the Federation? This is a fantastic question from my point of view, working with NCBA CLUSA, the domestic umbrella for co-ops in the US. So it's a great question. Love to hear from Cornelius or others.
Yeah, and Doug, I'll take a quick stab at it and definitely want you and others to join in, because that, just like the nature of that question, I think this is a time for a cooperative response. But as you all know, cooperation among cooperatives is one of the principles. And I think as much as we adhere to that principle, the better off we are. And organizations like NCBA provides that vehicle for us to cooperate and work together. But it does require all of us speaking with one language. And as it relates to advocacy, we can't just do enabling legislation in the South. We have to make sure that there's an overall cooperative legislation piece. A bigger part of this in terms of co-op legislation is all of it tied together, not just about the South. So there's uniform co-op laws as we've talked about over the years. And so how do we look at this, not just from a perspective of the South, just making sure the South and Black farmers and co-ops are part of the conversation, making sure that we take the conversation together and realize that, hey, when we sit down, when we work together, we have to put a list of all of our needs and look across that list and say, what are the things that we have in common, and focus on that. So as long as other co-ops outside of the South understand that the co-ops in the South are also part of the equation, I think we'll do a good job of listening to each other and working with each other, making sure that our platforms are always built around a common cause.
Yeah, and I do have a couple thoughts about that, but I might wrap them into my final comments. And I'd like to hear from Monica. I think I just saw you kind of raise your hand. I'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, and I just want to add to that the sense of solidarity in this work in terms of policy building is so important, regardless of which region you're in the United States. Many of the issues and challenges that we deal with in the South are similar. And I think it's important to collectively strategize about how we can build the best policies to ensure that our farm system is as strong and diverse as possible. So, certainly I mentioned the heirs property legislation, which was a first ever in the Farm Bill. Certainly, we're already looking to 2023 on how we can continue to build on those policies and ensure that there is a more level playing field for farmers across the South, especially farmers of color. So just having the collective support of other regions in terms of understanding what this issue is. It's an issue that is prevalent in many different communities, including Native American, tribal communities, but it disproportionately impacts African American communities. So just being educated about what it will take for us to ensure that land is an asset that farmers are able to tap into to continue to build stronger farming economies is very important.
Yeah. And Doug, let me add on to what Monica said here, because Monica and I were both on a panel at the NFU, the National Farmers Union annual meeting, a few months ago. And what we talked about was the importance of NFU understanding our issues, and we talked about heirs property particularly. But I gave an example about how 15 or so years ago, my predecessor, Ralph Page, was there at NFU talking about the Minority Farmers' Right Bill, something that the Federation authored that eventually became 2501, Section 2501 of the Farm Bill, which was about technical assistance and work to minority communities, Black farmers specifically. But that morphed into the Beginning Farmers Program, that morphed into veterans and women programs that NFU holds very highly and rightfully so. And so sometimes we're engaged in something that may seem like it's the work or the perspective of some group or one individual group, but it turns out to be something for the collective, no different than the civil rights movement. It benefits all of us when we look at it from their perspective. And then last but not least, I want to talk about the opportunity for us to create these marketing channels together. And I want to point to an example around the Neighboring Food Co-op Association. The chair of the NCBA board, Irvin Crowell, who's been working with us in terms of making sure that some of the co-ops in the Northeast are buying from farmers and co-ops in the South. And I think those kind of connections are important. It's the solidarity that Monica mentioned, but it's also the economic solidarity, if you will. And so how do we make sure we put money to that? How should we make sure that it impacts us economically as well? And so looking at these kind of markets also make a difference. And so I think there are a number of ways, but as long as we want to be engaged with each other and we understand that our issues impact all of us, I think we'll always move in the right direction.
Yeah, and I'd like to jump in very quick because I think that is a perfect segue. Because what I wanted to add is that, you know, I agree that we want to have as much universal cooperative legislation as policy as possible. But I think from a tactical point of view, we do have to recognize that historically, when we address kind of the particular needs of people who are consistently on the margins of our economy, when we address those needs, it has universal implications. Right. So, you know, one thing I would suggest from a tactical point of view is to, you know, support the Federation and some of the work that we're doing on the ground in terms of advocacy. For example, next month in May, we're going to have a cooperative symposium in Epps, Alabama, hopefully if the lockdown is over, where we're going to talk about how do we advance cooperative policy changes, you know, starting at the grassroots level. Because I think when you look at the South, we need more institutional cooperative power. And I think that starts at the grassroots level, from the bottom up. And I think the Federation is on the front line of really organizing with communities who are looking for opportunities to develop economic power through cooperatives. So that's what I'd like to add.
That's great, Terrence. Thank you, and Cornelius and Monica. I'll be brief. I think the leadership and staff of the Federation of Southern Cooperatives really kind of captured it well. You know, in answer to that question, it's the right way for me to provide a concluding comment on how the broader cooperative community can work together to bring to life, you know, these ideas that will help people use cooperatives to empower themselves in their communities and in their economies. That, in fact, is really at the core of what this project around the policy paper and the power and purpose and the other products that I talked about before, this partnership with the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. It really was about how to bring the power of the entire cooperative community to affect real change ultimately in local communities. I think when we look at historically what the cooperative community has done to do, you know, big things to impact in a positive way historically marginalized communities. And in fact, you know, we're running short on time here, but in fact, the actual establishment of the Federation of Southern Cooperatives itself in 1967 was certainly born from the region, but it was very much supported by the broader cooperative community, including then CLUSA, now NCBA CLUSA, and others. You know, and then there's a number of other examples like that where the broader cooperative community recognizes that if it can bring to force its collective weight, it can make real change. So I just want to thank again the Federation for Southern Cooperatives, because that need for real change is as evident as it's been in a very long time as we live through this COVID-19 crisis. I really feel like you've laid out the context, but probably most importantly, you've given us some ideas on actual solutions and tactics for change, and that includes the cooperative community working together to affect change in your region. So thank you again, Federation, for partnering and bringing us these great ideas. And I'll hand it back to you, Cornelius, and look forward to continuing to work together on this and many other things.
Well, Doug, thank you, and as always, thank you, and thank you to you and your team, NCBA CLUSA. I want to thank all those who joined us here today, because without you, none of this work is possible, and this platform doesn't mean anything. I want to thank all the presenters. I think you also saw some of the challenges we have in the South. They were bore out even in terms of this webinar. You have Melba and Ben who are in Mississippi, who are in rural Mississippi, who had challenges. They sent me messages saying they were on. We just couldn't hear them. We couldn't see them because they didn't have the capacity. Melba didn't have the capacity to get on where we could, the visual part of this, and Ben kept getting kicked off. So it lays out some of those challenges we have even around broadband and the challenges that we have in rural communities. So that was laid out here, but I hope we adjusted and accommodated for that. But for the issues, we apologize. But again, thanks to all the presenters who were on this call and presented their cases. I want to thank our team who helped put this on and make this possible. Many of them behind the scenes who you don't see. I want to thank NCBA for providing the platform and hosting this series of Power to Purpose, and CDF for their partnership and their continued support. I also want to thank many of our supporters and sponsors who make not only this work, but also make this webinar possible, including CoBank, NCB, the National Cooperative Bank, Nationwide, and various USDA agencies, including NRCS, the National Resource Conservation Service, the Farm Services Agency, FSA, NASS, and Rural Development. And in closing, I just want to reiterate the importance of cooperatives, the seriousness of this work, and the seriousness and the importance of enabling legislation and making sure more than anything else that your voices are always heard. So thanks again, and thanks to you all. And I want to take this time to say, please go to our website, give your input at the link. There's a link for the survey on the Survey Monkey, and that is given below. But also connect with us through Twitter, through Facebook, and other sources at Federation 1967. And we look forward to continuously engaging with you all, with our members, with the co-op community, and all of our partners. Thank you for joining us.